Good evening and welcome. My name is Ian Kerrigan and I'm the Senior Vice President for Exhibitions here at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. I want to first extend a warm welcome to our museum members and to those tuning in on our live web broadcast. Tonight's program is part of our Intersection series that examines the often surprising connections between 9/11 and today's world. Past programs have explored topics such as hip-hop, comedy, jazz, and tonight we turn to the world of comics. In the wake of 9/11, comic books became one of the first forms of popular culture to confront the tragedy, honoring everyday heroes, and helping readers process collective grief. That spirit continues today as artists use this medium to remind us of the power of resilience, community, and healing through story. This evening, we are joined by John Romita Jr. and Edgardo Miranda-Rodríguez, who will help us understand the role and power of comic books in the aftermath of traumatic events. John Romita Jr. is a celebrated comic book artist whose career with Marvel and DC spans more than 4 decades. Known for his acclaimed runs on The Amazing Spider-Man, Iron Man, Daredevil, and Uncanny X-Men, his work has helped shape generations of superhero storytelling. In 2001, he helped create The Amazing Spider-Man number 36, The Black Issue, a powerful tribute to 9/11 victims and first responders. Edgardo Miranda-Rodríguez is a graphic novelist, philanthropist, and creative director, best known as the creator of the award-winning superhero series, Borinqueña. Through his studio, please. Through his studio, Somos Arte, and the benefit anthology, Reconstruction, Reminiscing and Rebuilding Puerto Rico, he has raised nearly $250,000 to support grassroots organizations across the island. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and now please join me in welcoming John Romita Jr. and Edgardo Miranda-Rodríguez in conversation with our Vice President of People and Culture, Alejandro Victoria.
Well, first off, thank you all so much for being here. It has been just a few minutes before this, so many great stories, so much great conversation. And so I want to start off with asking you all, because superheroes have their origin stories. And what is your origin story that really made you fall in love with comics and passionate about them to this day?
Go ahead, you start. So I grew up throughout New York City, and comic book storytelling was important for me because by the time I was 18, I lived in 22 different places across New York City, Puerto Rico, Pennsylvania, Central New York. But comic book storytelling was able to provide for me a community because it was episodic storytelling. And these characters have been together in that same story over decades. So I knew if I was in the Bronx or if I was in Ceiba, Puerto Rico, and I caught up with Peter Parker could bring me back to where I was. And whether I was collecting bottles and cans to save up enough money to buy these comics, they were always there and they provided me a sense of normalcy. Just before the event, I'm also a fan. I brought these comics that I've traveled the world with me and I've had them for decades, and Johnny actually signed a bunch of them for me because one of the things I loved about John's storytelling as an artist is how human his characters look. And I meant all of his characters. His characters of color, his Black, Latino, Asian characters really looked it. And you can tell this is a kid from Queens who really loved and saw the humanity in all of us. And that, for me, kind of sparked the power of storytelling. Every week, I remember as a child, around my son's age, I had a teacher who would put 10 vocabulary words. And she said, I just want you to learn these words, write 10 sentences, and tell me that you know what these words mean, look them up. I took it upon myself to actually write a story that was episodic every week with these 10 new vocabulary words, and then I would draw a few panels to attach it to that. Yeah. And some of my friends saw that, so by the time I was in middle school, my friends would hire me for 50 cents or more to make them comics. So that's kind of reality. That's the origin story of what made me fall in love with comics, was that kind of community that was always there, the characters that were so beautifully rendered by John over all these decades consistently. And I was just telling him, one of my favorite characters that he drew was Monica Rambeau, who was, in the 80s, was Captain Marvel, right? And I just loved how beautifully strong he made her as a Black woman, and that still resonates to me. And I guess kind of like even subconsciously maybe inspired me to create La Borinqueña, who is also an Afro-Latin character. But yeah, that's my origin story, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you. That's awesome. John, what about you?
How am I supposed to follow that? You're a real rat bastard. I can't come up with anything that.
Hey man, you're freaking comic royalty, man. You know what I'm saying?
See, mine is so simple because I had a father who was an artist, and I watched him as a kid. But he was drawing romance comics, and my brother and I couldn't give a damn. And then one night in the middle of the night, I had a horrible nightmare. The monsters were coming out underneath my bed. And I went running up, the attics in Queens, you pull the ladder down and you crawl upstairs. And he was working up there. And I was crying like a child, and he's drawing, he's looking at me, and he didn't stop drawing. He's looking over. Again? You having another nightmare? Knock this off. He said, come here, sit down and watch this. And he was drawing, for the first time, he was drawing a superhero comic. It was a Daredevil number 12. And it has Kazar, who was Tarzan up in the trees, and Daredevil is surrounded by all the bad guys. And he's here, pay attention to this. He says, this is a superhero. He says, like the Superman and the Batman comics you saw at the barbershop. Because at the time, that was separate from what he was doing. He was drawing romance. He says, this is Daredevil, and he can kick the shit out of both of those two guys. That's what he said. He says he's a superhero, and he's going to beat up all these bad guys. And then I said, Dad, and I'm crying while I'm asking him this question. He says, yeah, he's going to beat up. I said, but there's 6 of them, or whatever it is. He says, don't worry. And he says, and the best part is he's blind. And he said, I sat down at that moment and started drawing on the floor of the attic. I started drawing what he was doing because I wanted to be like Dad. All of a sudden, it turned everything around to me. I was paying attention to comics. And I started to read comics. And the reason I say that's more than just a simple read. There were words in there that I didn't understand. I said, Dad, what does this word mean? And the first word I asked him what it meant was the word petulant. I cannot forget that moment because I'm reading a comic. Stan Lee always said he wrote to everyone. He didn't write down, he wrote up to everyone.
Yep.
So that children could understand. I had a vocabulary word. Nobody else in my grade knew what the word petulant meant. Oh, this is great, Dad. So I became a fan of vocabulary. I was reading comics. And it meant so much to me because he was doing things that I didn't understand. I had no concept of it. And I'd watch him draw. So suddenly I was drawing. And as school progressed, I progressed. And I got better and better. And then there was storytelling. Suddenly it involved. It was a stop-action film. And he was brilliant at it. And he would take us to see movies. We'd go see the old movies. We'd see On the Waterfront. And he would sit, and my brother was falling asleep. He couldn't give a damn. And I'm watching it. He says, watch this scene. Watch what's coming next. Oh, my God. He says, it's black and white. They call it film noir. Watch, it's going to rain. And suddenly, I connected comics with film. Unfortunately, it took 50 years for that to be legitimate. And I always thought that film people were morons for not attacking comics. But suddenly, this all coalesced, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. He said, no, you're going to be an artist, because I was doodling even as a kid, but it was just junk. He said, if you're going to be an artist, I want you to be a fine artist. Don't be a cartoonist like me. That's stupid. He said, you'll never make a dime. And the more he resisted, the more I wanted to be a cartoonist. Kids, you don't pay attention to your parents enough. But he said, if you're going to be an artist, be a fine artist. Don't be a cartoonist. Awesome. But we followed through with it. And as I got better, there was more to talk about. And I learned storytelling. I had an advantage over all the other guys in the business because I knew storytelling before they did. All I had to do was watch On the Waterfront, 12 Angry Men, all of these black and white films that were stories, and they made sense. And he would tell me what was coming. And I'll finish this with one anecdote. There was a movie called The Big Country. And there's a scene with Gregory Peck and Charlton Heston, and they beat the crap out of each other in a big fight, typical Hollywood. But all of a sudden, they pull back, and he says, watch this. The camera pulls back, and they're still beating the crap out of each other, but you hear the thud, it's muffled. He said, look how, and the screen, this was The Big Country. And I understood storytelling almost at that moment, and it was comics that made me understand film, and it was all because of that old man. He was a genius.
Rest in peace.
That's really great. And
But he made me.
yes, he was. You both have brought up the idea of storytelling, right? And the importance of storytelling with comics. And so why do you think comics are such a powerful vehicle to tell stories, and especially during a collective experience like 9/11, like September 11th?
It's a great question.
I think there's two ways to look at that answer. Neurologically, you're actually using both your left and right side of your brain because you're deconstructing text and you're also deconstructing visual imagery. And it's the only medium that will actually let you do that. Film is just audio and visual. A novel is just decoding text, but comic books is bringing both together. The other answer I would say is that, and speaking as someone who grew up impoverished, it's the only storytelling art form that is accessible to all classes and all people because it's so affordable. It's cheaper than a movie ticket. It's cheaper than a full-length novel, right? But it kind of like pulls you in and you get connected and you feel connected and almost like related to these characters, you know? And I think those are the two ways to look at it because I learned about visual arts in comics before I actually was going to museums, not even realizing that museums were actually accessible because I always assumed, oh, it's probably too expensive to walk into a museum. And now we're in a museum, right? You know, but that's my take, I think, is the accessibility of it.
To his point about film and comics, when we grew up, this shows you how old we are, there were no recordings of films. It was, you see it at the local theater or you watch it on television.
Yeah, like when you just said your dad would say, watch this, because your dad already saw the movie before he took you to see it. Exactly.
But you couldn't rewind.
Exactly.
Again.
Right.
With a comic, I think I read my father's and Stanley's Spider-Man, 1 year full of books. I think I read it about 30, 40 times, and it was there, and I could get to it at any second I wanted and say, Dad, this is great, what you did here and here. Can't do that with film when we were kids.
Right.
Now you can, dissect every second of every film. But this always stuck with us about comics is that it was immediate, right there for you, and it was there forever. You could always go back and look at it. But it's stop-action film. That's why I was amazed that filmmakers and producers didn't attach themselves to comics long ago. Every month, there were 10 or 20 writers that came up with fantastic ideas going on for decades. How could a producer not grab one of these writers? Here's $1 million, give me all your ideas. What's the matter with you people? What took you so long? And now they are relying on comics artists and writers. I think it's genius, and it plays to the point that storytelling.
Right, and I want to also add, one of the reasons why I went into making my own books and publishing my own books is that out of all forms of entertainment that can be produced, comic book storytelling is honestly the most affordable medium. Because that 22-page or 80-page comic book, if it's a conversation with me and Johnny in a coffee shop, or if it's the two of us going to a different galaxy and it's an incredible spaceship, it's the same budget to make that comic book. And when you do that with film, that's the difference between a $100,000 film and a $100 million film, depending on the special effects. But a comic book, if it's in outer space or if it's a coffee shop, it's the same budget. Yeah. And I think that's the other thing that makes comic books so lasting and so different than any other entertainment genre and medium out there.
And you mention locations, right? Like space or, anywhere else, right? In the coffee shop, right? How does a location play as a character? So in, Borinqueña with Puerto Rico or Spider-Man in New York City, how does a location play into that?
I got to start with this one. That was the difference between DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Stan Lee by himself took DC Comics, and not that it was derivative of all DC characters, but there was a similarity in that Superman, he was dressed in red and blue, had that stupid loop of a head hair, and he worked at a newspaper, and he had a crusty editor as a boss. Peter Parker worked at a newspaper. And his costume was red and blue. And he had a crusty newspaper editor that didn't like him. So that was it. But Peter Parker was real and lived in New York City.
Right.
Nobody knew what Metropolis was. It was a generic name, just like a Gotham City. Every one of Stan's characters was here. Mm-hmm. And we would drive, leaving on a Friday to go visit my grandparents in Connecticut, and my father said, "That's where Peter Parker lives." What? Are you, what? Dad, don't turn around. No, we gotta go. What are you? Yeah, he lives in Queens with us. Come on. Spider-Man lives in Queens. Yeah. This is what was the difference between those books and Stan Lee's and John Romita Sr.'s work. It was real. You take a brilliant character and give it reality, suddenly people can identify with it. Stan Lee, I remember this like it was yesterday, said the only thing that makes these great is the balance between reality and fantasy. Too much of one, you get bored. Even fantasy, you get bored with it. Too much of reality, it's a soap opera on television. Right. You combine the right balance and you have a brilliant story. And that's what Spider-Man was, the right balance. He was a Jewish kid from Queens that got the crap beat out of him. He lost, his socks would shrink. He ripped his costume, his aunt would yell at him. That's reality.
Yep.
That's what was great about these characters.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I would add that one of the things that was really great about the universe that Stan Lee created with your dad and other artists is that New York City was the co-star of all the books. It may have been an Amazing Spider-Man, or it may have been Daredevil, right? And Daredevil took place in Hell's Kitchen, a real neighborhood, right? But New York City was a co-star. And I decided to bring, when I first created La Borinqueña, almost like 10 years ago now, my idea originally was, okay, she's Puerto Rican, but she's from Brooklyn. She'll take a trip to Puerto Rico, get her powers, and then she's gonna come back to Brooklyn. But right around the same time that I published that first issue, the New York Times had put out a poll. And the poll asked, are Puerto Ricans US citizens? And less than half of those polled said, no, they're not US citizens. And that's when it clicked for me. I was like, I think I'm gonna leave all the stories in Puerto Rico, because there are already stories everywhere else, you know, from fictional to non-fictional places, right? And I said, but nobody's making superhero stories in Puerto Rico. And I can talk about so much stuff and never even have to leave Puerto Rico. I could talk about the environment. I could talk about political corruption. I could talk about corporatization. I could talk about displacement. Issues that affect people here in New York City and other parts of the United States, but I could have all of that still happen in Puerto Rico. And understanding what Stan Lee did with comics, making New York the co-star, I was like, oh, Puerto Rico is gonna be the co-star of our book.
Well said, well said.
Beautiful. So I want to now get to this comic here, right? The one.
That's my copy.
Yes, this is his. We got signed right before. But I want to go and start with, if you can pull up photo 2. And this is the image, one of the first pictures of this comic. And I want to touch base a little bit on this image is powerful. And you open this comic to this. John, walk me through a little bit of the story you have behind this photo.
The idea was to open up to what it was, no splash page. This was the initial image. The cover was black. And the writer, Joe Straczynski, the brilliant writer, said, let's open up with a shot of the pit. And my wife brings in a couple of photographs. She was doing all of the printing out at that time because we needed a reference. And she brought in a photograph that had a section of this, and I got as much reference as I could on it. It was the smack in the face, is what it was. If it's possible to reach out and slap everybody that opened this up to realize what had happened. And the most important part of it is Spider-Man's frustration. And the idea was that all of the superheroes were frustrated. They couldn't do anything about it. They were helpless. And that played into what was most important to me, was that the cops, the firefighters, the military, sanitation workers, everybody was helpless. And you could only imagine what the superheroes who had the power to stop it and couldn't stop it. So this was the beginning, because it was just this little corner of Spider-Man standing up there with the frustration, watching something that happened and he couldn't stop it. Yeah. And the idea was that no matter what, I don't know if it was in the book where he was a little bit full of himself or previous to that, but he's a superhero, he should be able to take care of this. No, you were helpless. And that was the most important part of this to me, was the real superheroes, the real guys were the frustrated ones, because buddies of mine, cops, said we were crying like babies, all of us. And that's what and even there's characters in this, the Doctor Strange, not Doctor Strange, Dr. Doom, crying over the senseless deaths. And this to me was the one that started it for the rest of the story. And I have this, and I have trouble opening it up. I really have trouble looking at it.
Can we go to photo 1? I also want to, Edgardo, you have this image. For me, when we look at it, it's pulling all of those pieces of place and in society and what's happening now, and what happened then, right? Can you tell me about this image as well?
This image, possibly for the first time ever in sequential art, that's our like vernacular for comic book art, right? Sequential art is possibly the first time you see historical moments captured like this, particularly because you have to go by journals and historical recounts, but there weren't obviously photos. The first image on the far left, you see the conquistadors battling against the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, the Taínos. The next image to the right of that, you see in the foreground a woman sewing a flag, and in the background is an uprising. This was an uprising against the Spanish Empire ruling Puerto Rico at the time. You go to the bottom left corner, you see a scene of people gathered around the Orlando Post nightclub, mourning the loss of lives at this massacre that occurred there. You go to the bottom middle, you have a group of enlisted army soldiers, the 65th Infantry, the Borinqueñas, fighting Nazis in Germany. Barely could speak English, but they are there fighting as Americans and as U.S. citizens as they are. And then you go to the final image where you see some flags and a flag with a black cross, with a white cross. That was another uprising in Puerto Rico, but it was almost like a civil uprising against, around the time of the U.S. invasion. And what I try to convey in this image intentionally, I didn't write, this is happening in the 1400s, this is happening in the 1800s. What you actually see is a dialogue between the goddess and my character, La Borinqueña, and they're having a conversation. And I remember having this conversation about this layout with Kyung, my partner and my wife, and she said, I think you really need to put some captions in there. And I said, no, we live in an era where there's so much over information. If people really want to know what this is, they can literally take out their phones, take a picture of it, and look it up on the internet. But I want the images to just speak for themselves and not to have to be handheld through this history. One of the things I want to say also about John's work and my work, particularly like when you go into this the conversation around Reconstruction, right? Spider-Man, the Black issue about 9/11, in my book Reconstruction, because they're comic books, we can turn this around way faster than a studio could make a movie with the same visual intensity and impact that a movie has. And John keeps going back to that because it is stop action like film. That's what comic books are, right? And I recall that when I made La Borinqueña, the first book that you see here, I wanted to address the fact that there was this massive economic crisis affecting Puerto Rico, right? And I knew that I could do this in a comic book because I could knock this comic book out in a couple of months. And I didn't have to wait a couple of years for a studio to say, well, we already have a queue of stuff that's coming up, so maybe we'll squeeze it in. And John and I had a conversation about studios that sometimes that doesn't even happen, you know? So that's one of the things also that's powerful about bringing real history, real moments in comic books is how the turnaround, that we could literally turn this around in less than a year. And it's still relevant. So when it comes out, people are like, oh, this just happened. Yes, this hits.
The other thing is that the creators that work on this, 2 guys, 3 guys, 4 people, each have their own story. Whereas a film is probably restricted to the producer and the director. That can come from 20 different people, and they can all have their own version. That's why it's so important to let comic creators run with their ideas and go to them and turn that into be 30,000 films in the next couple of years, just based on the stories from this gentleman and his artists and writers. It's limitless.
Yeah, and you all are bringing up, Edgardo, you brought up the immediacy of telling stories, right, in this art form. Is there ever hesitation, like, for example, you know, this issue, any hesitation about when to tell those stories of real tragedy? how do you navigate that tension? I wonder, John, what that was like when, making this, the tension between honoring that sensitivity, but also addressing the event directly.
That's a great question. You said there'd be no math on this test. I said no at first because I thought it was a cheesy thing to try and capitalize on such a horrible event. And I was quickly corrected. My wife didn't think it was a good, no, actually she said, don't say no. My father said no, my mother said no, because they thought it was an attempt to capitalize. Once it was explained to me that that's not the case, then it started to develop and it was important. And then it was a mad dash to get it done. I didn't have a chance to think about what I was doing. It had to be done. It was a deadline. All I know is every day she would bring in photos of the changing of this area. And I likened it to the film Clockwork Orange, where the guys are propped open and you look at this stuff every day. And every day I was looking at new photos. And of course it's no woe was me here. What I'm saying is that made it more than me just trying to knock out a book. It was more important than that. But it was everything you could imagine, every emotion was involved in it, and it was a comic book. And I suddenly realized that this was not a comic book. It wasn't even a film. This is a historic moment.
Yes.
All for the wrong reasons. We were approached by some moron at an auction house who said, well, I'll buy this from you because this page is decent, this page is better. I like this page, this has got superheroes in it. And my wife says, what are you talking? It's not a comic book, you moron. No, you didn't say moron. All right, you didn't. All right. You were going to hit him, though. She said, this is not a comic book. This is an event. This is a historic event. This from front to back. Yeah. And I don't think he grasped this. And in the middle of, as I'm doing this, I grasped that it was not just a comic book, but it's along the lines. There's something more important than a comic book.
Right.
He created something for Puerto Rico. This is different. It's important. Yeah, films can do it, but you can grab this immediacy. Yes. And that's important.
Oh, beautiful.
And I think that what was good about making these books, right, is that in time of crisis, in time of a disaster, in time of an attack, we are, as humans, quick to rise to the challenge of helping and lending aid. I'll do what I can. I'll show up. I'll bring water. I'll give blood. I'll donate money. But that's not sustainable. And it kind of fades after time, fades after a few days or a few weeks or a few months. And then the Spider-Man book comes out and it reminds you, this just happened a few months ago, right? And when we put out our book with Hurricane Maria, that book came out like 6-7 months after Hurricane Maria. When we released our book, Puerto Rico was still in a blackout. And it was 6 months after Hurricane Maria. When that Spider-Man book came out, there was still bodies being recovered. Mm-hmm. There was still toxicity in the air that you have to be very, very, and as the studies showed years after, how many people have suffered health ailments because care wasn't given immediacy to the toxins that were released when these towers collapsed, right? And this work, and John said this also, this work is tangible. And you can take it with you, and you can carry it, and you can share it. You can put it on the table. Somebody else can pick it up. Believe it or not, it's more accessible oftentimes than technology can be, because it's also a personal relationship issue. There's no device between you and the story. The device. How many of us pick up our devices? Oh, I need to do. Wait, what's this? Mm-hmm. Oh, no. Wait, what was I supposed to do? That doesn't happen when you pick up a comic. You pick up the comic, you immediately get immersed into that story. I actually love to read because I'm like, I don't want to be distracted by technology. So I go into a story and I'm like, I just want to be immersed in this narrative for now.
That's powerful. Can we get photo 5 up? Because I want to go back to something, John, you mentioned too, the first responders, right? And the powerfulness of this image, for example, is one of the last images, if not the last image of the comic, and it's so powerful, right? And I wanted to ask you what that thought process was when creating it. You said a little bit, it was about the heroes were the first responders. Just wanted to touch base a little bit on this.
First of all, hold up. Take a moment, everybody, and look how beautiful those faces are. Look how different all those faces are and how similar they are. And then look around us now. Literally, look around this room. This image is a reflection of what New York is, of what the US is. Sorry, John.
No, it's okay. You're making it difficult for me.
You make it difficult for me.
I appreciate it, though. The thought behind this was that at the end of it was to show the superheroes standing proud in front of the flag. And I don't remember the verbatim conversation. I said, but you know who the heroes are, right? And everybody kind of got quiet. Not everybody, the writer and the artist, the ink artist, Scott Hanna, who did a brilliant work on this. You know who the heroes are, because I had police friends, NYPD, FDNY, sanitation worker friends, military friends. They were the superheroes. And I said, wait a minute. These are the guys that saved our lives. Superheroes are comic book superheroes. So I made sure that we put them in front. And that was important to me. And not that they suddenly bought into what I was saying, but it made sense. And they said, okay, makes sense. Yeah, let's do it that way. And I got away with it, and they let me do it. I'm very proud of this. And that's what I've always said to military guys. I shake hands with every cop that will let me shake their hands, every firefighter. Say, thank you for your service. They save our lives every day. They're superheroes. I would tell the story about the 9/11 book. It would take too long. But a couple of firefighters wanted to shake our hands because we created a comic book. They thought, you guys are great. You're the best. These are guys that saved lives. Right. How could we possibly take credit for drawing an effing comic book? And these guys had children, and they ran to help us at the base. They drove across country from San Diego and Las Vegas through the night without sleep to help at the pit. And they wanted me to sign a comic book. Are you guys out of your minds? What's the matter with you? You should sign my comic book. No, you're great. Everything is relative, right. And these are the superheroes.
And now I know when you sign these, is there something in particular that you draw on them or have a story behind signing these issues?
Yeah, it's just a little doodle of the Spider-Man eyes. And Scott Hanna and I chose to sketch and sign this book forever and ever without any financial recompense, without getting paid for it. I keep, I'm trying to be eloquent because of this pain in the ass. So we've always done something on the cover. They call this a remark, but Scott Hanna has done extensive work, the Towers and Spider-Man, and it's gotten to the point now, this is 25 years, we're continuing with this, and we're going to try and get, Yeah. And we still can't get done because there's been reprints and reprinting of it. We're going to get it done whether it kills us or not, but always do a remark and always do a signature for no charge.
Fantastic.
It's important to us.
That's awesome. So we were talking about comics and the storytelling and the power of the storytelling, but how can comics help us process grief, and rebuild hope? Because this, from the firefighter, the story you're telling, this provided hope for those firefighters. And just I wanted to ask how comic books play that role as well.
It plays an important role, and just to kind of like carry over what John was saying, particularly from this image, and I think the same can be said about the pages of the books that I produce with our artists, is the power of representation, the power of visibility. And sometimes people use that phrase and some other people get triggered by it, but representation means so much. For children to see themselves, for women to see themselves, for people of color to see themselves, for service people to see themselves, right? And when you see yourself visualized in an art form that everyone is seeing, there's something powerful because then you feel powerful. You're feeling seen. Right. And that is so important. And when you feel seen, you feel that you are finally a part of the story that everyone is reading. And that is something I think that is so important that I hope we leave with tonight, with everything else that we're saying. Wherever we are in the world, with whatever we believe in, the most important thing that I think the two of us want to convey with our art and our storytelling is that we want the world to see our shared humanity and celebrate in that, and celebrate in every kind of corner of life or of us that we're able to see. Johnny told me this hilariously dope story about character that he created with his dad and how they were envisioning these characters that are now iconic in Marvel, and they visualized like these black women when they were creating these characters, right? The power of that, right? For these two Italians from Queens to see that. And that's because he grew up in Queens. So he grew up around everyone, Puerto Ricans, black people, Asians, Jewish, everything, right? And when you grow up in a room as diverse as this, right, you organically learn about our shared humanity. And I think that's the most powerful thing that comics can do. It brings us all together.
But it's also for children. Everything you said is spot on. Remember, these were basically entertainment issues for kids.
Originally, yeah.
And it affected how many lives of children?
Generations later.
I don't know how many young people read this or just looked at the art, or who knows. A lot of adults, but those adults were kids when I first started. Now their grandkids are coming. Oh, Marona,
But I was one of these kids.
Right.
I was one of these kids.
I.
I'm not that far, only a few years apart, but I was telling Johnny, like, I have my collections from the 70s, you know what I mean? And I brought a bunch of these books, but we're here now as storytellers and as parents, and you're right, this was a genre, a medium that was created originally for children, but it's become, honestly, this is as American as jazz, as hip hop. And people keep forgetting that this is an American art form that's been around for almost a century now. And this is ours that we can claim. So for it to be like in a museum like this is dope. I mean, these should be in museums, you know what I mean? And it shouldn't even be up for debate. This is American art, and this should be celebrated.
Parents and grandparents bring their kids anyway to conventions, and they are still reading books. They can see a movie in a second. You got to be careful what they see. When my son Vinny was a kid, I was doing something called Kick-Ass. It was foul, violent, and more violent. And my wife says, "Don't let him see this stuff."
And he literally just did it, put his hand in front.
He looked at me and says, "Dad, I can see that anytime I want to in a movie." All right, see, there it is. So why should I be afraid? However, this was still for children. This was a medium for children to read, and it was important because we get our point across, and kids now still read comics, no matter what's in it. And I bring it up, little kids will bring it up, and you have to honor that. Doesn't mean we can't try to take advantage of the parents by doing something adult, but the kids still read it.
I actually write my books based on my childhood of reading what your dad and Stan did and what you did with other writers, because what I loved about comics from the 70s and 80s, and I'm being very specific about those 2 decades, it spoke to everyone. If you were a kid, it spoke to you. If you were an adult, it spoke to you. But it kind of like went into, if it was for a child, it went over their head. And if it was for an adult, they could really like understand it. And so I took that model when I make my books for La Borinqueña, because I have 2 sons. This is my youngest son here. And I thought to myself, I'm in my studio, which is in my apartment. I don't want to do this. When they say, "Hey, Dad, what you working on?" I want to say, "Oh, this is the dad moment. Come over here. Let me tell you what I'm working on. Okay, in this panel, this is happening. And in this panel, this is happening." And Kyung and I would have conversations. Like that scene of the history, there's some violent scenes. And she says, we need to make that blood blue to keep it very, very safe, because the child is going to read this. And when we made the books, we didn't know that from 8-year-olds to 80-year-olds were going to be reading our books. We didn't know. So, but I had an idea. I was like, I want to write it somewhere in the middle. I don't want it to be too kiddie, and I don't want to be too over-the-top violent and too adult. I want like somewhere in the middle, just like these books I grew up on.
This is a great segue into from innocence of a comic book to all of a sudden Stan Lee and Jack Kirby create a character called the Black Panther.
Great story, yeah. Tell us.
Probably one of the best characters ever created. 2 Jewish guys from Brooklyn. And my father explained to me, he says, you watch the news, and in the news is the Black Panthers, but the comic was done first. And he said, you pay attention to this, because this is a great character. And a king from Africa became a superhero. Holy shit. this is not comics anymore. This is newspaper, this is film, and the two of them are geniuses for creating that. And look where it is now.
Right.
60 years later, 65 years later.
Yeah. Crazy.
That's why comics became important, because suddenly there was topical information in it that is historic.
Right.
And God bless that character.
Yeah.
God bless the two guys that created it.
Looking back now, more than 2 decades later from September 11th, what feels lasting about the way that comics responded to that event?
Well, I think
I got
it
nothing.
keeps
Go ahead.
it keeps it real and it keeps it now. When you open up that book and you see that splash page of Spider-Man with that frustration, it feels as raw as if it just happened. And that's what comic book storytelling does. It's a personal experience with you in that story. You know, you're not sitting in a movie theater with a whole bunch of people. It's just your eyes and that book that's opened in your hands. And you have the words and you have the images, but you're casting the voices in your head and the sound effects in your head. And you are choosing to stay on that page. No one is like forwarding those pages for you. And you stay on that page. And I think that's the power of these stories. Decades later, 20 years later, in the case of the Spider-Man Black book, right, the 9/11 book, or my stuff, it keeps it real. And more importantly, 20 years later, in the case of Spidey, it keeps the discourse still alive. It's not like, that was 20 years ago. We don't need to keep talking about that. Then why would we need a museum? Because we need to keep talking about this.
There's no way of faking it either. He said it's personal. He's right. You can't fake that, because either I asked you to get into that position, or I asked Joey when he was a kid to do that. That feeling of complete frustration. I don't remember who posed for me, but I remember thinking that you can't fake that. If you fake it, any reader's going to find out that you're just a glory hound. That's important to both of us, especially concerning this anniversary. I can't put it any better than what he did, but once again, you jumped on me, you bastard.
I love you too, bro.
Well,
I'm going to go first from now on.
John, I'll ask you this one, though, too, is what can creators, fellow comic book creators, or creators in general in this form, learn from this issue, this process, in responding to global crises?
Unfortunately, American creators were only affected because it happened in our backyard. If you want to reach out to the world problems, that's going to be, because then suddenly editors and producers are going to say, well, how are we going to sell something about a fight in Ukraine? Come on. Right. When it's already been filmed in every way, shape, or form. So I can't answer that. However, there's got to be a way where the news is brought into this without hitting you over the head with a hammer.
Right.
It can be done. You have to touch on it, but you can't ruin the moment. The kid thinks of fantasy. And if you bring in the news to it when it's on 24/7 in every network, I think there's got to be a way of doing, I said, balanced fantasy and reality. I don't know if we can do something that's as newsworthy as this without looking like a glory hound, because it's covered 24/7 in every way, shape, or form. I'd be lost coming up with the answer, but doesn't mean can't try it. Keep it topical, entertain, and topical at the same time. I don't think film does that. Why do filmmakers preach? I don't understand these people. You're supposed to entertain, you morons. So you entertain and you hint on it. You touch on it. Don't hit me with the hammer. I know what's going on. I'm not a moron. Now, the funny part is we are going to be guilty of it if we're not careful. Going overboard is the danger. So that's why you have to touch a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of reality, and see if you can find the right balance.
And I think what's done really well, and what I've done with my books, particularly the book after Hurricane Maria and in the Spider-Man book, is that no heroes are there to save the day. In this case, it is Spider-Man, but that's the entire Marvel universe, from Doctor Doom to Captain America is in that book. In Reconstruction, the book we did, it's Superman, Wonder Woman, La Borinqueña, Batman, and all these other DC characters. And my directive when I was doing that book is like, no one's coming to save the day. It already happened. It happened. Now we got to deal with it.
Right.
No powers. Pick up a shovel, pick up some of those boards. Is about recovering. And I think what makes that book powerful is not seeing buildings exploding, it's seeing the impact of the lives that it affected after. And that's, I think, what is lasting about these stories is that it tethers it to reality. And when you have great artists, and I'm sorry, Johnny, you're amazing. When you have a great artist like John
All right, I'll
Romita,
pay you later.
yeah, who has that beautiful balance of giving so many different characters such real humanity, and then also having an incredible grasp of like cityscape architecture, that perfect balance. And if you know comics really well, it's hard to find people that can do both. You can have people who can draw the human body beautifully, but can they draw that body in front of an actual real city? No, or vice versa. And Johnny has a way of balancing that. And there's so much of his heart that goes into each one of those panels and pages. And yes, he worked with Scott Hanna, who's an incredible inker, but it's still kind of poured out of his imagination into that graphite, onto that Bristol board, right? And I think that's what's powerful about this medium. Is, again, to reiterate, it's the personal effect that you have, the personal take on it, but the artist's and the storyteller's approach to a nuanced storytelling. Yeah. Not like you said, not a hit him over the head, but just like a nuanced storytelling.
Absolutely.
You're not going to make me follow that, are you?
No. Actually, we are now going to open up for any audience questions. So if anyone has any question in the audience, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic down over here. We'll start out here.
So you both spoke quite a bit about meeting fantasy and reality and finding a balance. What goes into your process to actually find that balance?
For me, I don't know about you. You talk about movies a lot, and I love that because when I do a lot of writing, I do character designing, and I do a lot of my page layouts. We call it thumbnails, right? And I will work with our artists because I'm not a sequential artist. I'll be straight up like that. This is the maestro right here, right? But I'm more of a storyteller, and I am an artist, but not a sequential artist. I consider myself a writer all the time. I'm writing right now. This conversation is helping me write. When I'm watching a movie or a show, I'm writing. Because as I'm watching something, and if something pisses me off, I think to myself, well, my character would have done da 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 da. And I think, oh, that's good. Now I can save that. If I'm at a cafe and I'm having a conversation with a young person, that's also me writing. Because I'm like, oh, cool, I'm getting this interaction. If I meet somebody, so for me, my process is constantly processing. It isn't just me literally in front of that keyboard or me with a pen on a piece of paper. The process is organic. I'm constantly in that space. And especially as an independent storyteller, I don't have the luxury of always having 100% of my time dedicated to the writing. I have to do the marketing, the business, the public speaking, the hustle, as we call it, right? So I really have to kind of like depend on that like muscle I've developed to see that I can find a story in just existing and being in this space. And then a lot of times I would just email myself like, oh, this was dope, what she just said. And I'll email myself so I can remember that. And then I'll make sure to search for it in the inbox later.
Yeah, I've mailed a couple of things to myself. So
right?
Well, first of all, you also get a way of copywriting it without having to copyright. The United States government has just
there you go.
It. But to your point, when I first heard Stanley say those words, you got to balance the reality and the fantasy. I remember having a conversation with my father about a couple of his friends that he grew up with. And the colorful characters that he grew up with are incredible. The names Schmuggy and Bimbo and Booney, you know, where do you find these people? So he would tell stories. My uncles and aunts would tell stories about all these guys they grew up with in the 40s. And the idea of adding fantasy to these maniacs, that's the balance. And suddenly you can do a story, but that's where the balance of reality and fantasy came with me, because I said, well, I have great characters. I grew up with characters, great characters. You add a little bit of fantasy, put one of them in a skin-tight costume,
exactly.
And you'll sell 1 million copies. The guys that I grew up with, the guys my parents grew up with, but they were in the neighborhood. That's all you need to do is look around.
Exactly.
Open your window and the whole world walks past you in Queens. That's where we were able to come up with great characters. You add a little bit of fantasy. I put my friends in so many stories.
Right.
Colossus and the Juggernaut destroy my friend's bar, the Grand Tavern. God rest the soul of the Grand Tavern. They have a fight in the bar. I put all my friends in the background. They destroy the bar, ruin it, destroy it. And instead of my friend saying, "Gee, thanks," he said, "Do I get paid for this?" Thanks, Jimmy. That's really kind of you to say that. Well, you ruined my play. But that's fantasy, adding reality to fantasy, because these two superheroes. But that's the fun part of it, and that's how it becomes great, because there's just the right amount of each.
Yeah, that's dope.
Any other questions?
There was a young lady right there with the hat on, yes.
If kids are not really reading books in school anymore, why not bring them up to...
Keep going, because my wife has got to be interested in this one. Go ahead.
Then why don't we give them comic books, and that's things that they're going to like to read? We tried that. And
Do you want to speak to it, or you want me to do it?
no, for it.
Early on, when I first met my lovely wife, Kathy, she was amazed that comics weren't part of schools. Her son, Joey, was disinterested in reading. She put a comic book in front of him, and suddenly he was interested in reading, and now he's brilliant. And that put her in the direction of approaching the Department of Education and connecting it to Marvel. It didn't work out because of some, pardon my language, asshole that worked at Marvel with a suit on. But it was her idea to do this, and your point is cogent. Yes, that should be a part of education. Not because it's glory, not because of anything like that, but this helps. You put images to words, and kids remember those words. Good point.
And we're trying to do that in our very, very small way. There's actually a digital platform now that many primary and middle school students use called iReady. And they actually reached out to us, and they're using La Borinqueña in iReady, and they actually did my biography, which I was like, what? And it's in there as well. But I was able to do that because I'm literally, it's me and my wife. So we don't have guys in suits. At least I hope not. I think I'm the only suit, you know what I mean?
You know anybody you want to talk about? No? Okay.
And because we're small, we're able to have these conversations. And we're actually both teaching artists. But it is a struggle because there's some schools that are super receptive and some that aren't. But we actually have kind of like been working on this code of how do we take comic books, not only the books themselves, but how do we even take the art of teaching making comics. And we actually do 2 workshops. We do 2 workshops on making.
That's fantastic.
I think we have time for one more question.
2 more. There's 2 people.
Yep, that's.
How are you? I'm actually an educator in the Department of Education.
Oh, hey.
I work in the Bronx. I'm also a Boricua. So
There we go.
I actually love comics as well. I grew up with comics, and my father's favorite is Peter Parker. So I love DC and Marvel, so Universal.
No,
That's okay. He drew Superman
Right.
for a minute.
I understand the whole blue curl thing, but to answer the question, my kids are coming from an urban community where comic books is their life. So they do read comic books. They do read anime. Anime is a very big thing as well. And comics is a big basis of discussion. And we're just finishing up we just finished teaching 9/11. My kids just came here a week ago.
Fantastic.
We just finished talking about Columbus and the perspective of the Taínos and learning about the indigenous, the indigenous groups of Puerto Rico, and understanding what their role is in this world and what their contribution is in the bigger scheme of life. And they know that they're not, because of the pandemic and their reading levels and writing levels, they do not feel that they have that balance and being able to excel. And comic books gives them that world.
I didn't think of it putting it that way. That's wonderful. That is brilliant.
Give them that well. And I just wanted you both to understand what you have done in a way that you don't even understand in terms of representation, in terms of being able to create a world that is possible for some of these teenagers to have the possibility to know that they can expand beyond that. My mom grew up reading Archie comic books and being told that that wasn't something that would expand her world. She's a writer. She is someone who started from there and made me believe that I could read and do anything I can. My parents are first responders and recovery from 9/11. They're the superheroes that you drew in that comic book, okay? And I tell my children who are BIPOC kids, who don't believe that they will excel, that they are the prayer that their ancestors have been asking for. So what you are both doing is something it's just tremendous. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh boy.
Ooh,
I think we've got one more.
Don't ask me to talk for a couple of minutes.
I think I see one right there, and then this will be our last question before we wrap up.
Hi, my name is Vaughn. So you were talking about comics getting in the hands of kids, and I think that's one of the most important things. I actually have a book that I'm a writer-creator dedicating to my own dad and uncle who died in 9/11, and putting that message of heroism, I think in the eyes of children, is more important than ever. But oh my God, is it difficult, like getting it out there? What would be your advice for creators, and how do I get that message to as many
You
people
want
as
to stay
possible?
here for another hour?
Yeah, right. That's part two.
It wouldn't be enough, especially with him by himself. He could do it. It's easy. Heroes are superheroes. You can't. Spider-Man is a guy in a police uniform. Captain America is Captain America. The moment when Spider-Man says, "I don't know how you," because Captain America went through World War II. How did you stand and watch this? How could you stand it? They're heroes, cops, firefighters, military. It plays itself. There's no need to even explain it. And your children will understand it. Your grandchildren will understand it. All you have to do is honor those heroes. It's self-explanatory.
Got it.
Is there one more that we could squeeze in? Because otherwise I'll keep talking.
Yeah, we can do one more, and then we'll.
I think that somebody once said, with great power comes great responsibility. And to her point, you guys have a great power with your medium, and you guys are nailing the responsibility part. My question is, for both of you, when you wrote your respective art, did you feel a certain responsibility to represent your community? You know, particularly with the 9/11 story, being from Queens, did you feel a certain responsibility to maybe respond on behalf of New York? Because, you know, Peter's in New York, Steve is in New York, everybody's in New York. Did you feel a responsibility for that? And,
Yes.
And same with your work.
Absolutely. Not just because it was important to be accurate historically, but because this was under a microscope. You can't, like I said, you can't cheat this. You have to do it right. And you'll get told immediately that you messed up. Don't cheat with the readers. They're smarter than I am because they know what they want. And if you don't give it to them, they'll say, "Hey, you didn't give it to me. I don't like this." And I could see you're cheating here. You copied this. Where's this? Mom, I'm sorry. I won't do it again.
And to add to that, I did a lot. I have a degree in sociology and anthropology, so I do a lot of research before I actually finish my books. And I also have like this weird thing of I always have to reconcile what I'm writing. I can't just write it. I'm like, I have to make sure that this is gonna work and it hasn't been done before. It won't be misinterpreted. And so I studied a lot of science and political news before I wrote my first book, and had a conversation with my wife and decided that the first book that I published in December 2016 of La Borinqueña wouldn't have a supervillain. Because I was like, I'm introducing a woman as the main protagonist, a Black Puerto Rican woman, and I don't want there to be any relationship, even if it's a dysfunctional one, with a supervillain. I want her to kind of like literally stand on her own feet, and I don't want to perpetuate patriarchal storytelling. And I also saw that there were many scientists, even this consortium of scientists out of Germany, who created this extensive study predicting, based on their data, that there were going to be intense natural disasters in the next coming years. And they were predicting earthquakes and hurricanes. And Kyung and I talked about this, and I said, that's it. The villain is going to be a natural disaster. It's going to be a hurricane. And that book was published in December of 2016, and Hurricane Maria happened 9 months later. And that was, wow, talk about litmus test. That was me like, I got it, I hit it. Because not only was I talking about something that nobody wanted to talk about, but I put it on paper. And I remember when CNN reached out to me, like when Hurricane Maria hit, hey, we want to know if you're going to talk about the hurricane in the next book. And I was like, I already did. They were like, what? And I was just like, and I'm like, look, I'm not a witch. I'm just a nerd that reads science and actually sees what's actually happening. But I'm also an artist and a storyteller, and I just put it in there, you know? And I think that's kind of like the true test, when you kind of like are true to what you're writing. And that's what I wanted to add to your question. If you're writing from your true self, and if you're writing from that true experience, whether you're an Italian kid from Queens or a Puerto Rican kid who grew up all over New York City, right? It shows. We're not pretending to be somebody we're not, you know. And in a real way, we're as real as you can be. There's no ego up here. We're teasing each other, but this is not about ego. This is about really us loving this art form, loving each other as human beings, and loving the opportunity that somebody even showed up tonight to listen to us.
And to revere our heroes.
Yes.
Right. We
Exactly.
would want to also just, we're at time, but thank you both so much.
Can't do another hour?
Here,
I was getting warmed up.
thank you both so
Thank
much
you.
for being here.
Amazing.
Thank you.